Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming and thank you for inviting me to present tonight. It's a real pleasure to be here and to share some of my research with you on a topic which traditionally hasn't featured prominently in the story of Orkney. Before I begin, I've got a kind of minor disclaimer to make, and that's that I gave a version of this paper in April to the Centre for History at the University of the Highlands and Islands. So I apologise to anyone who attended that because I'm going to be subjecting you to more of the same tonight. However, this actually provided an opportunity for me to present the final product, whereas in April this was all very much research in progress. So that's basically just a polite way of saying that I got bits wrong in April and this paper corrects the record. I was also told by my colleague Glenn Campbell that the paper in April was good, but it needed more Orkney in it, so I've tried to rectify that here tonight. Now, I'd like to begin, like all good self-respecting papers on Orkney should, with a word from George Mackay-Brown. This particular work is one of George's lesser-known short stories, published in around 1976 and entitled Soldier from the Wars Returning. Now, spoiler alert for anyone who's been waiting since 1976 to read this, but the tale follows the journey of an Orcadian soldier who had enlisted in the Marquis of Montrose's Royalist army in 1649 and who had fought at the fateful Battle of Carbisdale on the 27th of April 1650. The story begins with the soldier confused as he finds himself alone on the battlefield, and assuming that Montrose had emerged victorious against the hosts of Lowlanders, mercenaries and Biblemen, that's what he calls them, he decides to walk home to Orkney. In true M. Night Shyamalan fashion, the soldier is actually dead, and this is his ghost making his final pilgrimage home. Along the way, he becomes increasingly confused and angry that so many people ignore him and openly discuss treasonous things in his presence. On the boat across the Pentland Firth, he's accompanied by a few Caithness fishermen who he describes as regicides and traitors compared to his loyal and true self. And also in their company is a minister, and in true 17th century Presbyterian Scotland fashion, the minister doesn't mix his words. He laments the foolishness of the Orkney men who had enlisted in the Royalist army, saying that they should have bidden at home. They should never have listened to that scented creature with the golden tongue, i.e. Montrose. By the time our soldier returns to his house, he finds that he is, in fact, dead, and he also, just to rub salt in the wound, finds that his lover has taken up with another man in the village. Reflecting on all of his life choices that have taken him to this point, the soldier concludes that out of loyalty to my king, I have betrayed my fields and our unborn children. Now, aside from being a great story and clearly the inspiration behind the 1990 film Sixth Sense, this short work is significant because it is the only manifestation that I've come across of this episode within modern cultural memory. Personally, I've only spoken to a couple of Orcadians who knew about the Royalist occupation of Orkney, with the present knowledgeable company excluded. And likewise, there is very little knowledge of the key role that the islands and islanders played in the Carbisdale Campaign. A few years ago, when the first Marquis of Montrose Society, which I'm a council member of, approached Orkney Islands Council to inquire whether it might be possible for a commemoration of some sort in Kirkwall, the council at the time responded saying that while they were not opposed to the idea, they questioned where a memorial could go which would commemorate the, and I quote, ill-fated adventure which duped so many Orcadians and led them to their deaths. So when the Carbisdale Campaign is remembered in Orkney, it tends to be a memory of sadness and loss, if not outright betrayal. Now, this is interesting because it contrasts so starkly with the widespread knowledge of the Cromwellian occupation of Orkney during the 1650s. And this still has modern markers today in the form of Cromwell Road and Cromwell Drive in Kirkwall, and the oft-repeated local knowledge that the only things that Cromwell brought to Orkney were cabbages and syphilis, but I'm not actually sure that either of those things are true. This peculiar Orcadian amnesia of this period in more modern times has been commented upon by Murdoch and Simpson, who edited the memoirs of George Wishart, Montrose's contemporary biographer, and they suggested that the only explanation that they could see was that such memories were overlaid and effaced by the English occupation of 1651. This dearth is starkly presented in the fact that the two most cited histories of Orkney, Thomson's New History and Craven's History of the Church, covered the entire episode in one page each, and neither of which are particularly detailed. Orcadians aren't alone in their disinterest in the 1649-50 campaign. Most histories of the civil wars in Scotland treat the last hurrah of Montrose as more of an interesting footnote than an important development in the conflicts. It's been described as a lost cause, a forlorn hope, and a desperate final throw of the dice. This has always surprised me because most accounts agree that there was a huge contribution of manpower from Orkney, equating to around 1,000 men, most of whom are thought to have died at Carbisdale. And to give you a comparison, Orkney lost 578 residents during World War I. So clearly something significant happened here which warrants further investigation. But to date, there has been no in-depth research conducted on the Carbisdale Campaign, with the exception of the late great Ted Cowan's 1977 book on Montrose. Now, I came to this from kind of two parallel points. Firstly, I'm co-writing a book just now on the Scottish Royalist armies with Dr. Ed Fergal, so I wanted to completely re-examine the military aspects of this campaign and fill in some of the significant gaps in our understanding of the expedition. And secondly, during my PhD, I'd come across deposition records from 1650. Now, for anyone that isn't familiar with what a deposition record is, it's essentially a church court record where a minister has been forcibly ejected from the kirk. And I was specifically looking at evidence for political depositions for Royalist support during the Civil Wars. And there's a massive spike in these depositions in Orkney in 1650. All bar two of the Orcadian clergy were deposed by the kirk for swearing loyalty to Montrose during the Carbisdale Campaign. So as well as examining the military aspects of the campaign, I also wanted to investigate the impact which this had on Orkney and try to understand why there was this black hole in terms of modern memory of the period. Before I show you what I've been working on, for those who might not be familiar with the Civil Wars in Scotland, I'll give you a very quick crash course. Upon the backdrop of religious, economic and political tensions in Scotland, England, Wales and Ireland, the 1640s had witnessed civil war erupt in all three Stuart kingdoms under Charles I. In Scotland, this began with the signing and propagation of the National Covenant in 1638, which was a defiantly Calvinist confession of faith which, rather subtly but not subtly enough to avoid notice, placed an individual's loyalty to God over their loyalty to the Crown. What began as a protest against the unchained prerogative of the Crown and its implementation of an Anglican-style liturgy in Scotland quickly developed into a national political movement whose supporters became known as the Covenanters. Those who supported the Crown in all this, the Royalists, accused the Covenanters of political and religious extremism, branding them traitors and anarchists. Two civil wars in Scotland, known as the Bishops' Wars in 1639 and 1640, had seen the Crown militarily defeated and control of Scotland effectively handed over to the Covenanting regime, which now dominated both the Kirk and Parliament. In 1641 and 1642, in part caused by the Scottish crisis, civil wars erupted in Ireland and England respectively. When the Covenanters allied themselves with the English parliamentarians in 1643, this reignited civil war in Scotland, with the Scottish Royalist army led in the field by James Graham, Marquess of Montrose. After 2 more years of civil war and a series of Royalist victories, known as the Year of Miracles, the Royalists were eventually defeated again. Montrose and other leading Royalists either escaped to the continent or accepted punishment at the hands of the victorious Covenanting regime. Between 1647 and 1648, there had been a coalition of moderate Royalists and Covenanters known as the Engagement. And the Engagers had attempted to invade England, free Charles I, who by this point was in custody on behalf of the English parliamentarians, and bring the wars to a close. But they too had been completely routed, allowing for a more hardline faction of Covenanters under the command of Archibald Campbell, Marquess of Argyll, to seize power in Scotland. And that's where we need to begin today, with the Royalists defeated and in exile, Charles I in parliamentarian custody, and the Argyll faction in control of Scotland. In June 1646, Charles I had written to Montrose ordering him to disband Royalist forces in Scotland and flee to safety on the continent. After initially delaying these orders and then struggling to secure safe passage out of Scotland, Montrose and a following of Royalist officers arrived in Bergen, Norway on the 10th of September. Soon after arriving in Bergen, Montrose set off again on what was a tour de force of Europe, stopping at various courts of European leaders and heads of states, holding meetings with various delegates, and this was all done in the hopes of securing support, both political and physical, for the Royalist war effort. Between arriving in Bergen and January 1649, Montrose travelled to Oslo, Holstein, Hamburg, Paris, Geneva, Tyrol, Vienna, Prague, Presburg, which is modern-day Bratislava, Krakow, Danzig, Copenhagen and Brussels. He found that while verbal support was abundant, few heads of state were forthcoming with tangible support. Instead, France and the Holy Roman Empire, who were still embroiled in the last stages of the 30 Years' War, were keen to entice the Marquis, whose exploits had won him fame on the continent, into their own service. And despite this newfound fame, after fleeing Scotland, Montrose actually became very much a background figure in terms of the main developments of the civil wars between 1646 and 1649. He played no role in the engagement. In fact, he was an outspoken critic of the venture, claiming that these fair-weather royalists could not be trusted, and that Presbyterians, and that's what he calls them, sought to pull down monarchical authority. And that in itself is a very telling development in Montrose's own ideological outlook by this point, since he was one of the original signatories of the National Covenant. The Marquis was even politically marginalised at the Royalist court in exile, which in Charles I's absence had become dominated by the Queen, Henrietta Maria, and a cabal of mostly English Royalist courtiers, who favoured a negotiated settlement with the Covenanters over any kind of military campaign. By the end of 1648, there were strong indicators that Montrose intended to accept either imperial or French service, but that all changed on the 30th of January 1649, when Charles I was executed by the English parliamentarians. The death of Charles sent the Royalists reeling, but it also ensured that European ears were far more open to their petitions, as the European heads of state recoiled as one from the events in England. Scots could be found across Europe at this point, in its courts, in its armies and in its towns. And even before Charles I's death, he had dispatched Patrick Ruthin, a Scottish-born veteran of the 30 Years' War, who had risen to become the Earl of Forth and Brentford and was the former Lord Commander of Royalist forces in England. Ruthin had been sent by Charles I just before his death to the Swedish court in order to try to secure men and supplies. Negotiations between Ruthin and Queen Christina of Sweden and the Riksråd were actually underway in 1649 when news reached Sweden of Charles's execution. Ruthin at this point doubled down and pushed very hard for contributions of weapons and munitions and asked for permission to enlist Scots in the service of Sweden's armies for the Royalist army. The Swedes agreed to underhandedly, and that's how one contemporary report describes it, give the Royalists huge amounts of arms and supplies and would deal with volunteers on an individual basis. At the court in exile, the young Charles II, who had been newly proclaimed on the eve of his father's execution, and his many senior Royalist advisers had begun to plan for a new campaign, which they believed was needed in order to utilise the widespread dismay at the actions of the English Parliament. The goal of this was to either subjugate all three Stuart kingdoms or secure a more favourable negotiating stance from Ireland or Scotland. So Ireland and Scotland emerged as the two obvious theatres for a Royalist resurgence because the actions of the regicides in England were almost universally reviled there. The proponents of an Irish campaign were led and championed by James Butler, the Marquis of Ormond, and Prince Rupert of the Rhine, while the Scottish option was proposed by Montrose and his supporters, which included Scots Royalists like Ruthin, James King, Lord Ethan, who was an Orkney-born Scottish veteran of the 30 Years' War, and Ludovic Lindsay, the Earl of Crawford. In May 1649, Charles II granted Montrose a commission to treat for foreign levies and supplies of all natures and to support and conduct them accordingly, effectively giving him the initial green light for a new military campaign. As Royalist High Command hummed and hawed over the precise strategy that they would pursue, a huge network of Royalist agents were dispatched across Europe to try and secure men and supplies. Scottish Royalists, mostly associates of Montrose, were particularly prominent in these negotiations. And as you can see on the screen there, Scots were across the European courts in these negotiations to secure this kind of support. Now, like I mentioned, huge amounts of arms and supplies were secured from Sweden, weapons and money were gifted from Denmark, and various German dukes also offered their support, including the Dukes of Holstein, Brandenburg and Courland. The Royalist call to arms also attracted the attention of the vast population of Scots abroad, including Colonel John Gordon, who was serving in the Swedish army at the time, and when Gordon secured his commission to join Montrose, he wrote to the Swedish court requesting that he be allowed to take his entire regiment of men with him. This was quickly and forcibly denied by the Swedish court, but Gordon came along anyway. There were also arms purchases made in Hamburg, and mercenaries and volunteers were recruited across the Netherlands, Sweden, Denmark, Norway and Germany. The Swedish garrisons in northern and eastern Germany were particularly targeted by Royalist agents because of the size of the Scottish communities there, and the prominence of Scots within those garrisons, such as Major General Robert Douglas, who was by that point the governor of Swabia. It was decided that all of the arms, supplies and cash collected for the war effort would be equally split between an Irish and Scottish campaign until a new plan was formed. To give you a bit of an idea of the amount of weapons and supplies that we're talking about, this is a manifest of one of these shipments of arms from Sweden on the left hand side of the screen. Now, all of the Swedish supplies were coordinated by a Gothenburg-based Scottish-born merchant, John Maclean, and Maclean acted as Montrose's factor in Sweden. Now, you might be able to work out on the right-hand side of the screen there, this is a note which was attached to this manifest of arms, where it clearly states that John Maclean was in receipt of half of the arms. Now, to save your eyesight and your Swedish translation skills, this is what that list looks like in English. So clearly, and this is just one shipment of arms, this is some serious firepower. We've got 8 regimental 3-pounder cannons and over 1,500 muskets. Now, I'll come back to these particular supplies because a portion of these almost certainly equipped the troops levied in Orkney for the campaign. As well as benefiting from a change in diplomatic mood on the continent, the Scottish Royalists also had reason to believe that the wheel of fortune was turning in their favour at home. While planning was underway for a new campaign, a small Royalist rising had erupted at Inverness, led by Thomas Mackenzie of Plisgarden, the brother of the Earl of Seaforth. This resulted in the borough's garrison being ousted and the town falling under Royalist occupation. This in turn sparked a series of events which, in retaliation for Plisgarden's rising, the senior Scottish Royalist George Gordon, Marquess of Huntly, who was in Covenanter custody at this point, he was executed essentially to try and send a message, but this in turn caused his son, Lewis Gordon, to rise up in support of the Royalists, alongside John Middleton, the Earl of Middleton, who had been a prominent engager. The Royalists were eventually defeated at Balvenie in May 1649, but this all boded very well for a new campaign. It showed Montrose and his allies on the continent that there was an appetite for war and that there was a pool of discontent which they could draw upon. So all of the ingredients were there for another year of miracles. However, it's important to note here that following the defeat of Balvenie, Plisgarden, Lord Gordon and Middleton all went into hiding in Scotland, and Lord Ray, the head of Clan Mackay, was captured at the battle. Meanwhile, George Mackenzie, the Earl of Seaforth and head of Clan Mackenzie, sent various letters of support to Montrose and Charles II. However, he showed no interest in going with the army back to Scotland. By this point, Mackenzie had taken up residence at the Court of Exile and showed no sign that he was going to move. Now, these cracks in this Royalist network would become apparent, and hopefully will become apparent in the slides ahead. But the plan seemed to be, at least from the outside, moving in the right direction, and it was supported by a coordinated PR campaign. From accounts of past victories to declarations to satirical songs, Royalist prints were churned out in the Netherlands and Sweden to rally support and public opinion to the King's cause. You'll also notice that all of these prints on the screen just now were produced in English, so clear that the intent here was to disseminate them through the British expat community on the continent, as well as through clandestine networks back into Scotland. The real mechanics of organising such an ambitious military campaign were in the works as early as February 1649. Montrose had received by this point his official commission from Charles II to serve as Captain General and Lieutenant Governor of Scotland, which were both actually commissions that he'd held under Charles I. Between February and June, while all of these supplies and men were being collected across Europe, Royalist High Command dithered as to which theatre of war to pursue, Ireland or Scotland. However, that decision was made for them by June, with Oliver Cromwell's victories in Ireland convincing them that the Scottish option presented the best chance of success, so it got the full green light at this point. By the summer of 1649, the Royalists had enough men to form the core of an army, they had supplies, they had diplomatic support, and all they needed was an actual plan for launching this new campaign. Key to this was George Hay, the Earl of Kinnoul. Kinnoul was a long-time supporter of Montrose. He had fought under him since 1644, but more importantly in this instance, Kinnoul was also the nephew of Robert Douglas, the 8th Earl of Morton, whose father had gained the rights to the earldom of Orkney in 1643. Morton was a vocal, if rather inactive royalist, thus it seemed that he would provide the ideal host for an invasion army. The plan was then this, that the army would land in Orkney alongside its supplies, where it would establish a base of operations. Orkney could then act as a launch pad for this invasion of the Scottish mainland, while continuing to operate as a fallback point and a safe port for more continental troops and supplies. And this plan was put into action in August, with Kinnoul assigned the command of the 1st detachment of 100 soldiers and 80 officers, and they were given a cache of arms which was said to be able to furnish 1,000 men. Amongst these officers were two men who deserve special mention. Captain John Gwynn, who was a Welsh veteran of the civil wars in England, whose account of this campaign is recorded in his memoirs, and it's a key source for this part of the campaign in particular. The other person who deserves special mention at this point is Lieutenant Colonel George Drummond. He was the brother of John Drummond of Balloch and one of the key figures in Orkney following Kinnoul's landing. Now, Kinnoul's detachment was meant to travel to Orkney aboard a frigate, a brand new frigate, paid for by the Archduke of Brandenburg, but due to Brandenburg's constant delays in actually handing over the money, they were forced to hire a more meagre, old and quite frankly battered ship which didn't even have any cannons. Now, this could very easily have ended in disaster, because after the ship left the docks in in Amsterdam, not Hamburg, it was pursued by an English frigate. But thanks to the intervention of storms, not unlike the horrible weather that we've been having this week, the Royalists managed to escape. And then their luck held, because they narrowly missed another 3 English men of war when they safely arrived in Orkney. Now, in his memoirs, Captain Gwynn puts this down to God's divine support rather than pure dumb luck. Whatever it was, once in Orkney, Kinnoul's luck certainly held. Having had some prior knowledge of the Royalists' approach, Morton ordered that all of the Orcadian lairds and gentry, via Patrick Smith of Brakel, to convene at Harrykirk to receive orders from the King. Soon after Kinnoul landed, he was welcomed with open arms at Bursey Castle by Morton, who immediately authorised the levying of 400 men to form a regiment of Orcadian foot. Having heard of Kinnoul's landing, Robert Hall, who was the captain of the 18-gun frigate the Greenock, which had just happened to be anchored off the coast of the Orkney mainland, Hall defected to the Royalists. Hall's an interesting character. He'd previously worked as a bit of a gun runner for the Engagers and then as a privateer in the Irish Sea for the Covenanters before migrating north. So it's difficult to be sure whether his motives were pure or purely business, but Hall soon established himself as a vital cog in the Royalist war machine, securing another 10-gun bark, and for anyone who doesn't know, a bark is a 3 or more masted sailing ship, and replacing its captain, who was Andrew Love, with a Royalist alternative, Captain John Anstruther. This first period in Orkney is recorded in a letter which Knoll and Drummond sent to Montrose. The only bump in the road they faced was when Morton's obstinance called for the fact that he believed, as the kind of noble superior of this army, that he should be given temporary command until Montrose arrived, not Knoll or Drummond. Knoll and Drummond wrote to explain this to Montrose, but made it very clear in a very polite way that they did not think that assigning Morton overall command was wise. So in effect, these two men became the operational commanders of this Orcadian occupation force. By the 27th of September, maybe a week or so after Knoll's landing, news reached Edinburgh of the occupation. The Committee of Estates, which was the kind of covenanting executive body, was understandably deeply troubled by this news and ordered General David Leslie to oversee the organisation of an army which would repel this incursion. Upon taking up command, Leslie sent a letter to Knoll explaining to him that armed resistance was futile and advising that he escape now while he still had the chance. In response, Knoll had the letter publicly burnt at the gallows in Kirkwall by the hangman. However, Knoll's luck finally broke in November when he and Morton suddenly took ill with pleurisy. Morton died on 12th of November, followed shortly after by Knoll. Again, this could very easily have spelt disaster for the Royalists had it not been for Lieutenant Colonel Drummond, who took over command and managed to continue levying Orcadian troops in consort with the local Orcadian gentry. Having established the beachhead, Drummond now had to wait for the second wave of continental reinforcements to arrive. To help with transport, Hall and Anstruther's ships were dispatched to collect arms and mercenaries from Gothenburg and Hamburg. This also provided the opportunity to alert Montrose, who was in Gothenburg by this point, of the deaths of Morton and Knoll. By early December, Hall was in Gothenburg, and when he arrived, the Swedish arms were already being loaded onto vessels for transport to Orkney, all of which was being overseen by John Maclean. One of these vessels was the Swedish frigate Herdernen, which James King was in the process of buying off of the Swedish crown for a pretty good price, it has to be said. This means that the small Royalist fleet was now actually a force to be reckoned with. And while the materials were being loaded onto the transport vessels, 3 ships from Stralsund arrived in Gothenburg with around 600 mercenaries who had been recruited from the north of Germany. The majority of these troops were then boarded onto the transport vessels in Gothenburg to avoid drawing the ire of the Gothenburg authorities, who were already not best pleased by the fact that their city seemed to have become occupied unofficially by a Royalist army. Around mid-January, after several delays and logistical headaches, Hall and the transport fleet set sail for Orkney. Anstruther and the Herdernen ferried the fleet to Norway, but then returned to Gothenburg to pick up any stragglers and escort Montrose himself. Hall made it back to Orkney by late January, but one of the transport ships had supposedly been wrecked in a storm with the loss of all men and gear. Now, interestingly, this incident is not recorded in any Royalist sources, but has been was widely publicised by the Committee of Estates, who were keen to draw the conclusion that this was God punishing the Royalists. So clearly, God's providence could and indeed was very fickle. Despite Montrose's plan that the entire expeditionary force would set sail for Orkney in December, by February there were still men and supplies awaiting transport in Gothenburg, having become trapped by the encroaching sea ice. Now you can hopefully see on the map here just how debilitating the sea ice can be for Gothenburg because of the fact that Gothenburg's located so far upriver and inland. So when the sea ice freezes, it completely cuts off the harbour from the sea. But finally, in March, the Royalist ships managed to escape through the thawing ice, and on board Montrose was joined by a cadre of Royalist officers, which included his half-brother, Colonel Sir Harry Graham, and his one-time enemy turned second-in-command, Major General Sir John Urry. They arrived in Kirkwall by the 26th of March and quickly set about trying to make up for lost time. In light of the delay and the news that Charles II had entered into negotiations with the Covenanters at Breda, they would need to move quickly, at the cost of waiting for further reinforcements from the continent under the command of Lord Ethan. But by the time Montrose arrived in Orkney, he would have been heartened to see that the islands had been arrayed for war. Drummond had been busy overseeing the levying and drilling of around 1,000 Orcadian troops, supplied by the arms secured on the continent and distributed via this network of Orcadian merchants and gentry. Most proactive within this network was the merchant John Pottinger and Patrick Smith of Braco, who was the son-in-law of Bishop George Graham, the former Bishop of Orkney. Upon his arrival, Montrose was also presented with a declaration of loyalty signed by the Orcadian and Shetlander clergy, all bar the two I mentioned at the beginning. Now, this declaration swore to uphold the King's cause, and the Royalists in Orkney had already overseen the subscription of a new oath of loyalty, which had been sworn by all of the gentry and clergy, again bar the two ministers who I mentioned and who I'll come back to. Keen to press ahead, Montrose began organising the army for the invasion of the mainland. It was decided that Urry would lead a vanguard of, first it was to be 500 men, and this ended up being 300 men. But Urry was to secure a landing site for the main army before occupying Thurso and then advancing south to secure the Ord of Caithness. And while this was being carried out, the main army, which was by this point around 2,000 men, half of which would likely have been Orcadian, would be ferried across the Pentland Firth protected by Hall and the rest of the Royalist fleet. Now, I don't have time to linger too long on this, but if anyone is interested, this is the wording of the Oath of Loyalty which the Royalists pressed upon Orkney, Shetland and then laterally Caithness. It is explicit in its royalism. It condemns the unnatural rebellion maliciously hatched and wickedly prosecuted against his late sacred majesty of glorious memory, and pledges to return his majesty unto all his just rights, and particularly that it may please God to give a blessing to this present expedition of His Excellency James, Marquess of Montrose, Governor and Captain General. Urry's vanguard met with no resistance following its landing probably at John O'Groats, and they were then able to occupy Thurso before making their way south to the Ord of Caithness. The Earl of Sutherland, who was a staunch Covenanter, did send men to try and dislodge Urry from the Ord, which was a strong defensive position, but according to Captain Gwyn, these country bumpkins were quickly routed by Urry's men. The main army followed soon after, arriving in Thurso by the 13th of April, where Montrose called upon the gentry and lairds of the county to rise up in support of the King's army. Meanwhile, Orkney had been left under the command of Sir William Johnson, the newly minted Governor of Orkney, and a 100-man garrison led by Drummond. This ensured that the army had a safe place to retreat to if necessary, and it also offered Lord Ethan's troops a safe harbour for their landing, which was expected in late April. In the face of the Royalist army, most of the Covenanter troops in the north of Scotland had been ordered to retreat to Brecon, where Leslie was trying to gather up enough men for an army to meet the Royalists in the field. However, some strategic fortifications which lay on Montrose's road south were left garrisoned to delay the Marquess's advance. Thus, after establishing another garrison in Thurso and dispatching his brother into Caithness to raise more men, Montrose laid siege to Dunbeath Castle, the first of these fortifications on his path south. Dunbeath was valiantly defended by Lady Sinclair, as Lord Sinclair of Dunbeath had fled south to warn Sutherland, leaving the defence of the castle in the hands of his wife. But after a few days' siege, Lady Sinclair was forced to surrender and was permitted to join her husband in the south. The castle was then garrisoned by Royalist troops, likely drawn from the Orcadian regiments, and the army continued south. Dunrobin Castle was then the next obstacle on the road, but after a brief siege it was decided that it would prove too strong, and so the army left it, moving slightly inland before rejoining the coastal road. The army moved to Helmsdale and Garty, and then to Contradwell, then Reeves, continuing on to Grudes before finally camping at Carbisdale, which is where the modern Kilrain village is today. Now, anyone who's driven up that road, the A9, from Inverness up to Thurso to get the ferry over to Orkney, you will be very familiar with this route, and you actually drive almost the exact route in the car today. Now, this is the Ord of Caithness on your screen. Again, this will probably be very familiar to anyone that's driven this road. It is a stark geographical feature. It is very, very steep. It carries from the sea quite far inland, and in this period it was said to only have one safe crossing point. So if you can imagine that you've got baggage trains, you've got carriages, you've got cannons mounted on these kind of carriages, getting them across the Ord would have been a nightmare unless you controlled that one passing point, and that's why it was so important that Urry got south first and secured it for the army's advance. And rather helpfully, the army basically follows the path of the modern A9. So this is what the journey south would have looked like. The army likely embarked from the Ham Sound, then sailed to probably John O'Groats as its landing point, or even to Dunnet Bay, marched into Thurso, briefly occupied Thurso for a few days, and then moved south. And all the while the Royalist fleet was left in the Pentland Firth to defend Orkney, and also to basically use this as an opportunity to seize prizes, while the transport fleet was anchored in Thurso. Now, Montrose knew that the northern garrisons had been abandoned by the Covenanters, and he knew that Leslie was trying to gather men to meet him in the field. And he was informed by Scoutmaster Robert Munro of Agnes that the only enemy troops in the area was a single troop of cavalry, which would have been about 40 to 100 men, and it was likely heading south anyway, so it wouldn't have been seen as that much of a threat. However, unbeknownst to the Royalists, Colonel Archibald Strachan of the Covenanting Army and the Earl of Sutherland had convened a council of war at Tain, where it was decided that Strachan would pull together several elements of this retreating force from the north and attack the Royalists, while Sutherland would take the long way round into Caithness and try and engage the newly levied Caithness troops under Harry Graham. It was a brave plan because the Covenanting troops would have been quite heavily outnumbered, but Strachan hoped to use his cavalry superiority to basically harass and outmanoeuvre the Royalist infantry. But in order to do that, Strachan needed to draw the Royalists out of a fortified position and ensure that he engaged them in the open. To do that, he needed to lay a trap, and that's exactly what he did on the 27th of April 1650. So he hid most of the army in concealed positions around Carbisdale, and he presented the Royalists with the single troop of horse which they believed to be in the area as bait. Now, this is what the battlefield looks like today. We don't know exactly where it took place, but it's almost certainly in this area on the screen here. At the top of the screen, this is the view looking north, and you'll see that raised area at the top of the screen. That's likely where the Royalists had camped, which gives you a quick commanding view over this bowl shape running alongside the river. The river itself, which is on the right hand side on the top image there, this is the Kyle of Sutherland. And you'll notice on the bottom image, this is looking southwards, that ridge of high ground runs all the way along and then parallel to the river. So this creates this kind of flat triangle where the Covenanters wanted to draw the Royalist infantry out into so that they could fully utilise their cavalry. And that's exactly what happened on the 27th of April 1650. The Royalists spotted the Covenanter horse and they took the bait hook, line and sinker. The Royalist army was ordered to move out of the camp, and Urry was given command of the small detachment of Royalist cavalry, about 40 men, and Urry was told to go and engage this troop of Covenanting horse in front of them, while the rest of the army marched out of the camp and deployed along this high ground. So Urry took the cavalry, he rode down, and to his horror he discovered that that wasn't actually one troop of horse but around 240 Covenanting cavalry. The Royalist cavalry were then quickly routed and fled back north, running through the columns of marching Royalist infantry, who were then thrown into disorder and confusion just in time for the Covenanting cavalry to overrun into them. This meant that the battle is probably a bit of a grand phrase for it, because there actually wasn't a huge amount of resistance put up because of this confusion and disorder at the beginning of the engagement, and the entire Royalist army very quickly just broke and ran. The Covenanting infantry had been sent along that high ground on the left hand side of the picture here to try and engage the Royalists from the flank, but by the time they arrived, the fighting had basically already been done. Now, we have a very detailed account of the battle, which was published by the Committee of the States, and it has within it a list of all of the officers who were captured. So we know that, including regular troops, 447 Royalists were captured, but hundreds more were killed. There's special mention in the report of the battle of 200 Orcadian soldiers who were chased into the Kyle of Sutherland, who tried to escape over the river but ended up drowning. Montrose managed to escape the battlefield just. He had his horse shot out from under him, but he was dragged away by the new Earl of Kinnoul. So this isn't the same Kinnoul who died in November, this was his successor. But Kinnoul was injured and ended up dying shortly afterwards as well. So it was just Montrose and Major Sinclair, who was another Orkneyman, and they fled through into the Highland area to the north before trying to seek refuge with the Laird of Assynt, who had them arrested 3 days later. Sutherland, who had taken this long way round into Caithness, advanced with 300 men to try and engage Graham, who received word of the defeat at Carbisdale and decided to dissolve the troops that he'd managed to raise in Caithness and retreat back to Thurso, where he planned to sail for Orkney. And he did that just by the skin of his teeth, because just as Graham and his men were setting sail from Thurso, a Covenanting regiment of horse turned up to try and pursue them. Now, all of this is happening completely unbeknownst to Charles II and the Covenanting commissioners in Breda, who are negotiating this peace treaty, which is finally agreed on the 1st of May 1650 and is known as the Treaty of Breda. In response to the signing of the treaty, Charles wrote to Montrose on the 3rd and 5th of May, ordering him to withdraw from Scotland following the successful negotiations. On the 12th of May, Charles then wrote to Parliament to say that he was heartily sorry that Montrose had invaded Scotland and that he had ordered him to withdraw. Then news reaches the Netherlands of the defeat at Carbisdale. So despite the successful negotiations, Montrose was quickly taken from out of the custody of the Laird of Assynt, transported south to Edinburgh, where he was put on trial for treason, and he was executed on the 21st of May 1650. On the 30th of May, rewards were doled out to all of those who had helped defeat the Royalist army, including the Laird of Assynt and various officers who had taken part at Carbisdale. And interestingly, all of these prizes were to be paid out of fines extracted from those who had helped the Royalists in Orkney, Caithness and others who had been accessory to James Graham. Now, this is normally where the story ends in most narratives of the Civil Wars, but actually a lot happens after this, and a lot happens which is particularly relevant for Orkney. So like I mentioned, Graham narrowly manages to escape getting caught in Thurso by Covenanting cavalry who are pursuing him. And he manages to get the transport fleet which had been moored in Thurso, and they set sail back to Orkney, at which point he's joined by Hall and the Royalist fleet. Now, when Graham arrives back in Orkney, he finds that Governor Johnson is in the midst of trying to organise the defence of the islands against a suspected invasion which is on its way. However, Johnson is having a lot of difficulty by this point with the Orcadian lairds and gentry, who simply seem to have just had enough. He writes several letters to them calling for more men and supplies to ensure that the islands are properly defended, but on the 11th of May he writes his final letter to the Orcadian lairds, basically giving up and stating that he knows now that they intend to shift for themselves and therefore that he will do likewise, i.e. they are basically looking after their own interests now and he is going to do that for himself and his men, and the decision is made that Graham and Johnson and Hall will basically load up what is left of all the arms, supplies and money in Orkney, load it onto the Royalist fleet and set sail for the continent. Now, this causes a complete breakdown in the Royalist chain of communication, because while this is taking place in Orkney, in Shetland, where Lieutenant Colonel Wood had been sent to oversee the levying of a Shetlander infantry regiment, they're ready to go. They were delayed slightly, so they didn't join the army when it made its way over to the mainland, but they are now formed and basically awaiting word for their transport to Orkney and then to the mainland. But they then receive word of the defeat at Carbisdale, and this causes Lieutenant Colonel Wood to basically have 3 days of insane anxiety as he tries to work out what to do, because he doesn't know where anyone is and he doesn't know what's happening. And this eventually results in him deciding to flee for the continent and dissolve the troops that he had raised. Now, amongst this chaos, we see the real politics on the ground of what's going on, and particularly interestingly, there's 2 letters which are written by Patrick Smith of Braco on the 18th of May. The first is to David Leslie, the general of the Covenanting army, where he basically pleads ignorance. He states that he was kind of forced against his will to help the Royalists, and that at its first opportunity he had fled into Caithness and not basically tried to escape giving them any more support. At the same time, he writes a letter to his son telling him to destroy any evidence of Royalist collusion at home. So clearly Patrick had seen which way the wind was blowing and didn't intend to be caught in the crossfire. Now, during the confused retreat from Orkney, the Royalist garrison is essentially dissolved, and the Royalist officers are in this process of trying to collect the arms and armour that's left and load it onto the vessels. And at some point during this kind of process, a group of pro-Covenanting gentry in Orkney sees the opportunity and they capture Lieutenant Colonel Drummond and Major Melville. They then take the 2 prisoners to Notland Castle in Westray, and they write a letter to General Leslie requesting that he send 100 men to come and pacify Orkney and collect these high-value prisoners. Soon after, Leslie agrees and he dispatches Captain Cullis with a troop of horse of 100 men to basically subjugate Orkney and collect Drummond and Melville. Now, again, while this is all taking place, there are several people who realise that the wheel of fortune has now firmly turned against the Royalists, and 2 individuals who require particular attention are these 2 ministers that I mentioned at the beginning. So these are the 2 ministers, the only 2 ministers who are not deposed following the Carbisdale campaign, and they are Mr James Morrison, the Minister of Ely, and Mr Patrick Waterston, the Minister of Bursey. And they both write petitions to the Scottish Parliament asking for compensation for the damages that they had suffered for speaking in defence of the Covenant, or as they say, of the truth. And this is quite gladly granted by the Scottish Parliament. Interestingly, Morrison receives a bit more in terms of compensation, because he states that his 3 sons had gone against him and had enlisted in the Royalist army, so it's very likely that they died at Carbisdale, and it shows you the split loyalties which were occurring across households throughout Scotland. Now, to make matters even worse for the Royalists, on the 30th of May, Hall's frigate turns up in Leith. Now, Hall's ship turning up in Leith is a bit of a disaster for the Royalists, because what seems to have happened is, after setting sail to Norway, they had arrived in Norway before a mutiny had taken place on Hall's vessel, which had resulted in Hall and Harry Graham being captured and the vessel being basically taken over by the mutineers and sailed back to Scotland, where these mutineers hoped to sell these high value prisoners to the Committee of Estates. And they had arrived in Leith on the 30th of May and basically presented themselves to the Scottish Parliament. Hall and Graham were taken into custody, and on board Hall's vessel were found various lists and correspondences, including a complete list of those who had subscribed the Oath of Allegiance in Orkney. Now, this resulted in the near total purge of Orkney, of the Orcadian clergy, and this is where this deposition phenomenon comes from, and only 2 ministers are spared, unsurprisingly, Morrison and Waterston. Now, back in Orkney, Captain Cullis's occupation is described in 2 contemporary accounts. One says that Cullis produced much prejudice to the local population of Orkney, while the other says that much obedience was given to Cullis following his arrival. So it's not particularly clear what the response to Cullis's arrival in Orkney was, but what is clear is that there was no kind of armed resistance. So the Orkney garrison, which had been left behind, was fully dissolved by this point, and Cullis didn't experience any kind of royalist remnants trying to oppose his landing. Now, the political landscape is accelerating quickly by this point in Scotland, and following the treaty at Breda, Charles I finds himself in a very uneasy alliance with the Covenanting regime, and they decide to form a new army, which is sometimes referred to as the Army of the Kingdom, which was theoretically meant to be a kind of a coalition of royalist and Covenanting supporters, but in the end it's dominated by hardline Covenanters, and royalists are excluded from participating in it. And as part of the formation of this army, on the 3rd of July 1650, an act is passed in Parliament which puts the entire Kingdom of Scotland in a posture of defence, and provides a very detailed list of the contributions of manpower from each region in Scotland. And so Orkney and Shetland are ordered to contribute 1 troop of horse of 42 men and 1 regiment of foot of 750 men. And please keep in mind that this is on top of the huge amounts of manpower that they had already given over to the Royalist campaign. And so in August 1650, Major Campbell arrives in Orkney to levy these troops and also levy an additional 400 men. And this triggers a local revolt in Orkney, which is sometimes referred to as Currie's Rebellion or Currie's Revolt. Now, there's not a huge amount of detail on this, but this is hugely significant. So a local gentleman who is called Currie, and if anyone knows anything about Currie, please do get in contact with me, because he's never mentioned, as far as I know, again, he's never mentioned beforehand, but this Currie manages to completely take over the infrastructure of Orkney with this kind of local ragtag army of 600 men. They stop the Borough Council from meeting and essentially paralyse the infrastructure of Orkney after they take control. And so these mutineers, as they're called in the account of this period by the Borough Council, these mutineers did soundly bang Campbell and this detachment of officers who had been sent to Orkney to raise these troops. And so Campbell and his men are basically beaten up, they're taken captive, and then they're thrown in cells in the cathedral. Now, there's been some suggestions, including in Thomson's History of Orkney, that these are essentially the leftovers of Montrose's Royalist army. But I really don't think that's the case, because there's no references to them kind of pushing a Royalist agenda. There's no references to them declaring loyalty to the king or to Montrose. And what I actually think this is a Scottish example of a Clubmen event. Now, for anyone that might not be aware, the Clubmen are an English phenomenon which occurs during the civil wars in England, predominantly in the south of England, where local regions basically form militias to repulse recruiting agents sent from Parliament and from the Royalist camps. And essentially they are a localised response to the demands placed upon local communities in terms of manpower and supplies. And I think this is exactly what happens in Orkney, where the local populace or a faction within the populace decide that enough's enough and that they're going to repulse any attempt to take more men and supplies out of Orkney. Unfortunately for Major Robert Stewart, Parliament doesn't hear about Curray's rebellion. So they send another detachment of officers up under Stuart's command in January 1651 with an additional request of 300 horse, or 300 horse can't be found. They are to contribute 300 merks per horseman, which is absolutely a huge sum of money to request out of a battered population. And unsurprisingly, when Stuart arrives, he finds that Curray's in charge, and they promptly give them a doing and arrest them and throw them in the same cells as the other officers. And the situation actually isn't resolved until April 1651, when Sir James Douglas of Smithfield, who's the brother of the new Earl of Morton, he arrives in Orkney with a commission signed by the King. And this supposedly is enough to rally enough support from the local gentry in order to put down the rising and capture Curray and the ringleaders. This then allows for Smithfield to basically gain control of Orkney, and he oversees the levying of 600 men who are fully equipped and supplied and levied for the army of the kingdom. And that is essentially the story up until the occupation of Orkney by Cromwellian troops in January 1652, when Orkney is garrisoned by a Cromwellian detachment and the two forts are constructed, one on the harbour and one on the west side of town. Now, one of the richest seams of evidence from this period comes from the petitions which Kirkwall Borough Council send to the Restoration Parliament following the successful restoration of Charles II in 1660, where they provide very detailed breakdowns of the support and sacrifices that they've made from this period. And one of the particularly impassioned petitions that they send includes this line that there was almost no gentleman's house in the country but had lost either a son or a brother, and that gives you an idea of the scale of the loss in Orkney during this period. So if I can very briefly draw some conclusions from this and answer some of those questions which I laid out at the very beginning of the paper. Is the Carbisdale campaign a lost cause? I would say absolutely not, and hopefully this presentation has shown you the scale and the potential which the Carbisdale campaign possessed, and the fact that it posed a very real threat to the Covenanting regime. Now, there's a huge military debate about the tactics used during the Carbisdale campaign, because it represents quite a significant shift from the way in which Montrose operates in 1644 and 1646. I won't go into a lot of detail about that just now, but I think it is important to realise that the army during the Carbisdale campaign was very well provisioned. It was theoretically well led, although that certainly didn't seem to be the case at Carbisdale, because it had a very experienced cadre of officers, and it contained elements of troops from the Netherlands, from Germany, from Denmark, Sweden, England, Wales, and of course Scots, many of which were veterans. So this was certainly not the ragtag throwaway force that it's sometimes portrayed to be. Now, another kind of quite frankly condescending argument from a lot of kind of more recent scholarship is that the decision to occupy Orkney and launch the campaign from Orkney was never going to work because Orkney is too far away, and that this was basically a footnote from the periphery and it was never going to make an impact. That is complete and utter rubbish. Orkney found itself in this period at the heart of a Royalist network which spanned right across Europe, and the episode's significance is really only undermined by the fact that there is such a disastrous defeat at Carbisdale. And this is underlined by the fact that in the 1620s, when Habsburg Spain is considering an invasion of Scotland, they proposed this exact plan, that they would occupy Orkney and then launch an invasion of the mainland. So the idea was sound, and the fact that Orkney was ideally placed to provide this crucial link from the continent to the mainland of Scotland is largely ignored by the scholarship. Now, to answer the claims of a previous Orkney Islands council members, was Orkney duped? I would probably say not. Orcadians formed around half of the army at Carbisdale, and there is no record of them showing any kind of resistance to Montrose or the Royalist occupation. And indeed, many of the gentry, merchants and clergy seem to have willingly facilitated the campaign. And this was actually a badge of honour which Kirkwall Borough Council tried to use in their negotiations with the Restoration Parliament to seek compensation, because they were very quick to point out that they were the only shire in Scotland that had advanced His Majesty's service under the Marquess of Montrose. Now, unfortunately, I can't explain the Orcadian amnesia, but I hope that by carrying out more research and publicising this period of history, we can shine a light on the campaign and the hugely important role that Orkney and Orcadians played in it. Thank you very much for listening. Please do feel free to get in contact with me, especially if you know anything about curry or anything about anything else to do with the campaign. And I've just provided a short list of other works that I've done if anyone is interested. But thank you very much for listening.